The sky above the city was red that day. Not bright red, not the color of fire, but a deep, heavy red that made the tall crystal towers look like they were bleeding into the clouds. The wind moved slowly through the narrow streets, carrying dust and whispers together. And in the center of the great square, where leaders once gave speeches and children once played games, a single alien woman stood in chains, her hands bound with glowing metal restraints, her silver skin marked with faint blue, patterns that pulsed like quiet light underwater. And around her stood a crowd that did not look at her with anger alone, but with fear, the kind of fear that grows when people do not understand something, the kind that turns neighbors into strangers, and strangers into enemies. They called her a curse. They said her shadow brought storms. They said her presence made crops fail and ships vanish in deep space. They said that 3 years ago, when her broken escape vessel crashed outside the city walls. That was the day their luck began to die. No one asked what she had lost. No one asked where she came from. They only counted what went wrong after she arrived. And so, they decided the problem had a face, and that face was hers. Children were pulled away from her path as if she carried poison in the air. Elders refused to speak her name. Merchants closed their stalls when guards dragged her past them. And today the council had ordered her public display. Not execution, not yet, but a warning, a symbol, a message to the people that they were strong and united against misfortune. She stood silent while voices rose around her. Her eyes were a soft, glowing blue. Not wild, not angry, not broken, just tired, deeply tired, as if she had already watched one world burn before this one even began to fear her. A small stone hit her shoulder. Thrown by a boy who looked more confused than brave, another stone followed. Then another, but she did not cry out. She did not lower her head. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, and in that silence the wind shifted. At the far edge of the square, a human man stepped forward. He was not from this world originally. He had arrived as part of a trade delegation years ago. Humans were rare here, outsiders who kept mostly to themselves. And as he walked through the crowd, whispers changed direction. Now the fear had a second target. Someone grabbed his arm and warned him to stay back. A guard lifted a weapon and told him not to interfere, but he did not stop. His steps were calm, steady, and when he reached the chained woman, he did something no one expected. He knelt, not in worship, not in rebellion, but in simple human kindness. He looked at her face, not at her chains, not at the glowing marks on her skin, but at her eyes, and in a quiet voice that somehow carried through the noise, he said, "You look tired. May I help you?" The square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. The alien woman opened her eyes. Slowly, and for the first time since the crowd had gathered, something changed in her expression. Not hope, not yet, but surprise, as if she had forgotten that someone could speak to her without fear. The guard shouted at the human to move away. The council members watched from their high balcony with cold faces, and one of them announced that anyone who touched the cursed one would share her fate. The human stood up slowly and turned to face them. His voice was not loud, but it was clear. "If she is a curse," he said, "then I will share it with her." Gasps moved through the crowd like a wave. The word curse suddenly sounded weaker, less powerful, as if it had been challenged for the first time. The alien woman's chains glowed brighter. Reacting to tension in the air, the guards raised their weapons. And for a moment it seemed that violence would break out in the heart of the city, but the human did not reach for a weapon. He reached for the chain instead. His fingers touched the cold metal, and though it burned his skin, he did not pull away. Something strange happened then. The blue patterns on the woman's arms began to glow softly, not like a weapon charging, but like a heartbeat growing stronger. People stepped back, fear rising again, but this time it felt different, less certain, more confused, because the storm clouds above did not darken. The ground did not shake. No sudden disaster struck. There was only a man refusing to step away from someone everyone else had already judged. And in that quiet moment, before the council could give another order, before the guards could fire, before the crowd could decide whether to run or attack, the story of this world changed direction, not because of power, not because of war, but because one human chose to see a queen where others saw a curse. And as this story unfolds, if you want to see what happens next and how one simple act can shake an entire world, gently consider subscribing to this channel so you do not miss the journey ahead, because this was only the beginning, and the red sky above the city had just started to watch something very different from fear. It was about to witness defiance. When a human's fingers touched the burning metal of her chains and refused to let go, the silence in the square did not last long. It shattered under the sharp command of the council leader, and within seconds armed guards surrounded them. Energy spears pointed at the human's chest. The crowd stepped back as if fear itself had exploded between them. The alien woman did not resist when the guards pulled the human away. She only watched him with those quiet blue eyes that now held something new. Not hope yet, but awareness, as if she understood that the world had just shifted slightly in her favor. The human was dragged across the stone floor of the square and taken into the lower chambers beneath the council tower, a place where decisions were made in whispers and truth was often buried under fear. They locked him inside a narrow room lit by pale white panels, and outside the chamber walls the council gathered in emergency session. Their voices low but urgent, because this was no longer just about the so-called curse. Now, it was about control, about keeping the people united in fear, about stopping doubt before it could spread like fire. The council leader stood before a large projection screen and activated old records, showing images of destroyed planets, broken cities floating in space, suns collapsing into violent storms. And in every image there was one small detail repeated. The same silver figure standing alone in the ruins, the alien woman, the leader's voice, echoed across the chamber as he spoke about the pattern. Every system she visited collapsed within months. Trade routes failed. Stars became unstable. Civilizations fell. Coincidence was too weak a word for this. And so the council had chosen a stronger one, curse. Below in his cell, the human listened through hidden cracks in the wall. Because he had not come unprepared, he had spent years studying this world's systems, learning their networks, understanding their technology, and now he accessed the public archives through a concealed wrist device, pulling the same records the council had shown. But he did not stop at the edited presentation. He searched deeper into the raw data logs, the timestamps, the star fluctuation reports, the emergency transmissions that were never shown to the public, and slowly a different story began to appear. The destruction did not begin when she arrived in those systems. The instability markers were present long before her ships entered orbit, in some cases months earlier. And something else disturbed him even more. Several data entries had been modified, small changes, almost invisible, but enough to shift timelines and create a false sequence of cause and effect. Someone had rewritten history carefully, not to erase truth completely, but to bend it just enough to create a villain. And in the high chamber above, the council continued to debate whether the human should be exiled or executed alongside her. They feared his act of kindness more than any weapon, because kindness creates questions, and questions weaken fear. Suddenly the city's defense alarms pulsed faintly in the background. Not a full alert, but a distant warning from orbital sensors. The council ignored it at first, too focused on controlling their narrative. But in the deep space outside their atmosphere, something moved, dark shapes hiding behind radiation clouds. Ships that did not carry trade signals or diplomatic codes. Ships that had been following this world quietly for months. Waiting. Below in the cell, the human uncovered one final piece of evidence, an encrypted transmission attached to the oldest destroyed system record, a message intercepted but never released. The voice in that message was not hers. It belonged to an unknown species, cold and calculated, speaking about energy harvesting and containment failures, speaking about targets being neutralized, and speaking about the survivor escaping again. The word survivor echoed in his mind. Not curse, survivor. At that same moment, guards brought the alien woman into a containment chamber nearby, believing isolation would weaken her. But she stood tall despite the restraints, her blue patterns glowing faintly, as if responding to something far beyond the planet's sky. When a human was finally dragged before the council, he did not shout or beg. He requested access to the main projection screen, and the leaders laughed at first, but his calm confidence unsettled. them enough to allow it. He displayed the original timelines, the unedited logs, the proof of manipulation, and for the first time doubt entered the chamber like cold air through a cracked door. He explained that the star systems had shown instability long before her arrival, that someone had erased early warning data, that the so-called curse followed destruction, not because she caused it, but because she was fleeing it. And then the distant orbital alarm grew louder, forcing every eye toward the sky display. The hidden ships were no longer hiding. They were moving into formation, powerful, silent, and unmistakably hostile. The council members stared at the approaching fleet and then at the alien woman in containment, and fear shifted direction again. Because if she was not the cause of destruction, then perhaps she was the reason it kept following her, and perhaps the true curse was not a woman in chains, but the shadow hunting her across the stars as the chamber lights flickered. Under the first signs of orbital interference, the human turned toward her and spoke softly despite the chaos rising around them. "You are not the curse. You are the survivor." And this time when her eyes met his, the blue light within them burned brighter than before, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of someone who had run long enough and finally realized she might not have to run alone anymore. The warning lights above the council chamber flickered as the first wave of orbital interference rolled through the city. And for the first time since the alien woman had been brought to the square in chains, the fear in the air no longer pointed at her. It pointed upward, toward the dark shapes now visible beyond the red clouds. Silent ships resting like patient predators at the edge of the world. The council scrambled to restore control, issuing commands to planetary defenses, activating shield grids that hummed across the skyline. But deep beneath the panic, there was a new question none of them wanted to speak out loud. If she was not the curse, then why had the hunters arrived so precisely now? The alien woman stood inside the containment field as the human pushed through arguing officials and moved closer to her chamber. Guards hesitated this time. Unsure who the real threat was, the human did not shout or demand anything. He simply looked at her and asked in a calm voice, "Who are they?" And for a long moment she said nothing, as if the answer carried too much weight to release easily. Then the containment field flickered under power fluctuations from orbit, and in that brief, unstable second, her voice finally filled the chamber, soft but steady. "They're the end of my people." Silence followed her words, heavy and complete. The council leaders exchanged uneasy glances, and the human felt the shift in the room again. Not fear of her, but fear of something far older and far larger. She explained that her species had once lived around unstable stars, not by accident, but by duty. They were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were stabilizers, guardians of dying suns. Their bodies and technology worked together to regulate stellar collapse, preventing supernovas that would erase entire systems. For centuries, they had protected trade routes and young civilizations from cosmic disaster. And because of that power, they had also become a threat to those who thrived on destruction. The hunters were not conquerors in the common way. They did not rule planets or enslave populations. They harvested stars, draining energy from collapsing systems and converting it into fuel and weapons. And the stabilizers, her people, were the only force capable of stopping them. So the hunters did what predators always do when facing resistance. They eliminated it. One by one, her world's defense rings fell. Their star was forced into violent instability. And when the final barrier collapsed, she was ordered to escape with the last surviving core archive, a living memory of her civilization stored within her genetic patterns. She was not simply a refugee. She was the final record of species designed to protect life itself. The council listened in stunned silence as pieces of their accusation fell apart. The human felt a deep anger rising, not at her, but at the injustice of it. "They called you a curse," he said quietly, and she almost smiled, not with humor but with sadness. "I am the opposite of a curse," she replied. "I was created to hold destruction back, and yet wherever I go, destruction follows because they follow me." The realization settled heavily across the chamber. She was never the cause of collapse. She was the warning sign that collapse was already coming. The human stepped closer as emergency sirens intensified. "Can you stop them here?" he asked. Her glowing patterns pulsed faintly as she turned her gaze toward the planetary display showing the hunter fleet now moving into tighter formation. I can stabilize a star, she said, but I cannot defeat an armada alone. And there was something in the way she said alone that carried centuries of exhaustion. Outside the chamber windows, faint flashes appeared in orbit as the first skirmishes began between planetary defense drones and hunter scouts. The council leader demanded options, demanded strategies, but their military advisors offered only probability models filled with low survival percentages. In that chaos, the human made a decision that would reshape not just this world, but possibly the balance of power in the sector. He deactivated the containment field fully, ignoring the protests around him, and extended his hand toward her not as a prisoner being freed, but as royalty being escorted. You're not a threat to this world, he said clearly, so that everyone present could hear. You are the reason it still has a chance. For a moment no one moved, then slowly she stepped forward without chains for the first time in years, standing tall beneath the red light filtering through the chamber glass. And in that posture the council finally saw what fear had blinded them to before. She did not carry herself like a fugitive. She carried herself like a sovereign without a throne. The human bowed slightly, not dramatically, but sincerely. Your people may be gone, he continued, but their purpose is not. And if you are the last of them, then you are still a queen. The word hung in the air, strange and powerful. The hunter fleet shifted formation on the display, energy signatures rising sharply, preparing for a decisive strike, and as the ground beneath the city trembled from the first heavy orbital impact, the alien woman lifted her chin and the blue light in her eyes intensified, not with fear, not with anger, but with something far stronger, resolve. Because for the first time since her world burned, she was not standing alone in a ruined sky. She was standing beside someone who saw her not as a curse, not as a target, but as a queen who had simply lost her throne and was ready to reclaim her purpose. The first true strike from the hunter fleet came without sound, a thin beam of compressed stellar energy slicing through the upper shield grid and turning one of the outer defense platforms into silent debris. And in that instant, every doubt inside the council chamber vanished. This was no superstition, no bad luck, no curse whispered by frightened citizens. This was war. The planetary alarms shifted from warning to full emergency as the red sky outside grew darker under the shadow of descending ships, massive structures shaped like broken spears gliding into low orbit with terrifying control, their surfaces absorbing light instead of reflecting it, as if even the sun hesitated to touch them. Panic spread through the city below. Citizens who had once thrown stones now ran through streets, searching for shelter. And inside the chamber, the council leader received a direct transmission request. The signal cut through all encryption barriers, as if planetary security meant nothing. The main screen flickered and a tall figure appeared, thin and metallic, its face smooth and almost expressionless, eyes glowing a cold white, its voice calm and steady like someone discussing trade instead of extinction. Return the stabilizer and your planet will remain intact. Refuse and your star will destabilize within hours. The words were simple, but carried the weight of certainty. The council members stared at the alien woman standing beside the human, and for a second the old fear tried to return, because surrender felt easier than resistance. The hunters made it sound like a simple exchange, one life for billions, but the human stepped forward before hesitation could grow roots. You destabilized the other systems long before she arrived, he said firmly. You manipulated their records and blamed the survivor. The metallic figure did not deny it. Its expression did not change at all. Survival requires energy, it replied, and energy requires collapse. Your world is efficient. It would serve us well. The alien woman's glowing patterns brightened as anger finally surfaced beneath her calm exterior. You burned my people's star, she said quietly, and for the first time a faint distortion passed across the hunter's smooth face. Your people interfere with natural selection. It responded, weak civilizations fall, strong ones harvest. That is balance. The human felt a cold realization settle in his chest. These beings did not see themselves as villains, they believed. Destruction was order. They believed harvesting entire systems was progress. The council leader demanded time to consider the offer, but the hunter interrupted. "You have 1 hour." Then the transmission ended. The chamber lights dimmed, as if the threat itself had drained power from the air. Silence returned, but it was no longer uncertain. It was heavy with choice. The military advisors calculated defensive scenarios, and none offered victory. The hunter fleet outmatched planetary forces in both number and firepower. Surrendering her would likely save the planet, at least for now, and the council members began to speak quietly among themselves, some arguing that billions of lives outweighed one, others pointing out that if the hunters truly destabilized stars, then compliance would only delay the inevitable. The alien woman watched them without speaking. She had heard similar debates before on other worlds. She had seen fear choose surrender and watched those same planets burn anyway. The human turned to her and asked in a low voice, "If they take you, will they stop?" She did not hesitate this time. "No," she said. "Once they drain this star, they will move to the next, and eventually there will be nothing left to harvest." The council chamber fell into another uneasy quiet, because the enemy was no longer a rumor or a superstition. It had a face, a philosophy, and a deadline. Outside, the city trembled again as hunter scouts targeted communication satellites, cutting off long-range signals, isolating the planet intentionally. And deep in orbit, a massive central ship began to unfold segments along its hull, preparing what appeared to be a stellar extraction array. The human felt anger rising, but he controlled it. Anger alone would not win this battle. Unity might. He stepped into the center of the chamber and faced the council directly. "3 years ago, you chained her because you feared coincidence," he said steadily. "Today, you face the true enemy, and you still look for someone easy to sacrifice. If you give her up, you will not save this world. You will only prove to them that fear rules you." His words were not dramatic, but they were sharp enough to cut through hesitation. The alien woman stepped beside him, her posture straight, her presence commanding in a way that no chain could ever suppress. "I did not come here to hide," she said clearly. "I came because your star was already showing instability markers. I was trying to help without revealing myself, but they tracked my energy signature. I will not run again." The council members looked at her differently now, not as a prisoner, not even as a victim, but as someone who had been fighting a silent war long before they understood it existed. The hour countdown began to appear on the main screen, a cold digital reminder of approaching annihilation. And outside, the sky cracked with flashes as hunter ships tested planetary shields. The real enemy was no longer hidden in data logs or blamed on superstition. It stood in orbit with absolute confidence, believing this world would choose fear over courage just like so many others had. And as the timer ticked lower, the human realized the battle ahead would not only decide the fate of a planet, it would decide whether this civilization remained chained to its fear or finally rose to face the darkness that had been hunting them all along. The countdown above the council chamber glowed in cold white numbers as the final 30 minutes began to slip away, and outside, the red sky shook under controlled bursts of hunter energy, testing the planet's shield strength, each impact precise and patient, not reckless, as if the enemy already knew the outcome and was simply waiting for the world below to accept it. Inside the chamber, the debate had ended without truly ending. Fear still lived in some faces, doubt still whispered in quiet corners, but something had changed since the transmission. The alien woman no longer stood alone in the center of suspicion. She stood beside the human, and that simple image began to spread through the city's internal networks, because citizens were watching, listening, sharing fragments of what was happening inside the council hall, and the story was no longer about a curse. It was about a choice. The human stepped forward again, not toward the council this time, but toward the central communication console. He entered an encrypted access code that none of the alien officials recognized, and within seconds a new signal pulsed outward beyond the planet's damaged satellites, piercing through the hunter interference like a needle through cloth. The council leader stared at him with confusion and rising concern. "What have you done?" he asked, And the human answered calmly, I call my people. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the long-range sensors picked up distant signatures at the edge of the system, small at first, then multiplying. Human ships were entering the sector, not massive like the hunter vessels, not shaped like weapons carved from darkness, but compact, layered, flexible, designed for adaptability rather than intimidation. The hunter fleet immediately adjusted formation, recognizing the new arrivals as variables not yet calculated. Inside the chamber, the alien woman watched the incoming human vessels with quiet intensity. You did not need to risk your species for me, she said softly, and the human met her gaze without hesitation. We're not risking our species for you, he replied. We're choosing what kind of species we want to be. His words did not carry loud pride, only steady conviction. The council members felt the weight of that difference. Humans were not the strongest force in this region of space, not the most advanced, not the most feared, but they were unpredictable, and unpredictability disrupted certainty. The hunter fleet transmitted a final warning to all ships in the system. Withdraw immediately or be classified as hostile targets. The human fleet commander responded with a simple message broadcast openly across every channel. We do not surrender civilians. The tension in orbit thickened as both sides locked targeting systems. The alien planetary defenses reactivated with renewed purpose, not because they believed victory was guaranteed, but because the presence of allies changed the emotional balance of the battlefield. Below in the city streets, citizens began to see live projections of human ships forming protective arcs around key infrastructure points, smaller vessels darting between larger hunter cruisers, not engaging directly yet, but positioning carefully. The alien woman stepped toward the wide chamber window as flashes of distant light reflected in her glowing patterns. The human joined her side, and for the first time she allowed herself to speak without restraint. My people wore royal cloaks woven from star thread during times of war, she said quietly, not to show power, but to remind our enemies that we stood for something greater than survival. The human removed his own command mantle, a simple dark fabric marked with the symbol of his fleet, and without ceremony placed it across her shoulders. Then he stepped back slightly and bowed his head, not in performance, but in respect. Your Majesty, he said clearly enough for the chamber to hear. A murmur spread through the council hall, not of mockery, but of recognition, because in that gesture he had done something more powerful than freeing her chains. He had restored her identity. Outside, the Hunter flagship began charging its stellar extraction array fully. The planet star flickered slightly under distant gravitational interference, a warning sign that time was collapsing faster than the countdown suggested. The human fleet did not wait for the Hunters to strike first. Small strike wings launched in coordinated bursts, targeting weak junction points along the Hunter ships, not aiming to destroy immediately, but to disrupt synchronization patterns. The Hunters responded with terrifying precision, vaporizing 2 human fighters in seconds. Yet the human formation adapted instantly, breaking into irregular patterns that confused automated targeting algorithms. This was not brute force warfare. It was calculated defiance. Inside the chamber, the council leader watched the battle unfold and finally turned to the alien woman. If you truly can stabilize our star, he said carefully, then tell us how to assist you. The shift in tone was clear, no longer accusation but cooperation. She stepped forward, her eyes bright with renewed purpose. I will need access to your planetary core relays and uninterrupted energy flow for 12 minutes, she explained. And during those 12 minutes, your fleets must prevent them from completing their extraction cycle. The room understood the implication. 12 minutes against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations. The human tapped his communicator and relayed the plan to his fleet commander without hesitation. We hold the line for 12 minutes, he said simply. No one asked about the odds. The first full exchange of heavy fire erupted in orbit as the Hunters escalated from warning shots to lethal force. Beams of condensed stellar energy slashed across space, while human ships maneuvered in daring arcs, drawing fire away from the planet-star alignment vectors. Debris began to scatter across the upper atmosphere like falling metal rain. and down below citizens who once called her a curse now watched as humans shielded their world without demand for reward. The alien woman placed her hand on the central control interface. Blue light spreading from her skin into the alien technology as if it recognized her touch. The star's unstable readings flickered rapidly across the display. And, as the first minute of the 12 began, the human stepped closer and spoke in a low, steady voice meant only for her. "We are here. We will not let them take you." She closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength not just from the planetary core, but from the promise standing beside her. Because for the first time since her civilization fell, someone had not asked what she would cost them. Someone had decided she was worth defending. And above the trembling world, the battle intensified, not as a desperate last stand, but as the beginning of something the hunters had never faced before, a species willing to fight not for conquest, not for energy, but for honor. The first 3 minutes of the 12 felt longer than the 3 years she had spent running, because now she was no longer escaping destruction. She was standing directly in front of it, her hands pressed against the planetary core interface as streams of blue light flowed from her skin into the alien control system. The chamber dimmed under the surge of redirected energy, and the great red star outside flickered unevenly, as if aware that something ancient had awakened within its gravity above. In orbit, the battle intensified beyond cautious skirmish. The hunter fleet adjusted quickly to human tactics, their massive spear-shaped cruisers forming a tightening ring around the stellar extraction array that was slowly unfolding like a mechanical flower designed to feed on suns. Human ships darted through the ring in unpredictable arcs, drawing fire deliberately, sacrificing position to protect timing. Because timing was everything now, the human commander's voice echoed through the chamber speakers as he relayed damage reports with controlled calm. 3 fighters lost, 2 frigates disabled. But the formation still held. Inside the chamber, the council watched with silent tension as the alien woman's glowing patterns brightened to a level none of them had seen before, veins of light traveling across her arms and neck. Her eyes no longer soft blue, but burning with focused intensity. The human stood beside her, one hand hovering near her shoulder, but not touching, respecting the space of her concentration while silently promising presence. At the 5th minute, the Hunter flagship fired a direct gravitational pulse toward the planet star. The massive shockwave rippled through space, and the red sun flared violently. Alarms screamed across the chamber as stellar instability readings spiked dangerously close to critical levels. If the extraction array locked fully into alignment, the star would not simply dim. It would collapse inward violently, and then explode outward, wiping out every planet in the system. She opened her eyes sharply and whispered, "They're forcing early destabilization." The council leader demanded whether she could counter it, and she answered without looking away from the star's projection, "Yes, but it will cost me more than stabilization." Her voice carried a weight that made the human finally place his hand gently against her arm. "What do you mean?" he asked. And for the first time since revealing her past, she hesitated. "My species was not only designed to calm stars," she said quietly. "We were given a final measure, a safeguard in case stabilization failed. We can trigger controlled overload, forcing harvested energy to reverse direction. It would destroy their extraction network instantly." The chamber froze at the implication. Destroy the network meant destroy the ships attached to it, including the Hunter flagship itself. But controlled overload also meant channeling a star's violent potential through her own biological core. The council's chief scientist stared at her glowing form in disbelief. No living structure could survive that level of energy transfer. She met his gaze calmly. "Most cannot." The human understood before she finished the sentence. "If you do this," he said slowly, "you may not survive." She did not answer immediately because truth did not need decoration. Above in orbit, another wave of human fighters broke formation to intercept incoming Hunter bombers aimed at the planetary relays powering her. Interface, explosions blossomed like silent flowers across the sky, debris raining down and burning fragments. The 6th minute began, and the Hunter flagship shifted closer to the star, its extraction array nearly locked into full alignment. The alien woman closed her eyes once more and allowed memory to rise. The last image of her home world before it burned, the voices of her people as they ordered her to flee, the weight of being the final archive of a civilization that once believed stars were worth protecting. And then she felt something new, the steady warmth of the human hand still resting against her arm, not demanding sacrifice, not commanding heroism, just present if I fall. She said quietly without turning, "Do not let them say I was a curse." The human leaned closer, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "If you fall," he said, "you fall as a queen, and queens do not stand alone." The 7th minute struck, and she began the overload sequence, the blue light. Across her body intensified into near white brilliance as energy redirected through her cellular structure into the planetary relays. Outside, the red star flared brighter than ever recorded in the system's history. The Hunter flagship's extraction array vibrated violently as its own harvested energy reversed direction like a river forced uphill. Alarms erupted across the Hunter fleet as their perfect formation destabilized. Smaller vessels attempted to detach, but synchronization locks trapped them in place. The human fleet seized the moment, launching concentrated strikes at exposed junction points weakened by the energy reversal. The 8th minute, and the star roared across space in a silent explosion of light, not destructive but blinding, a controlled stellar pulse driven outward through her will. The Hunter extraction array shattered first, its segmented petals tearing apart under overwhelming feedback. Then the flagship itself fractured along structural seams never designed to handle reversed collapse energy, massive pieces of the dark vessel breaking away like shards of night being torn open. Inside, the chamber cracks spread along the floor as energy surged unpredictably. The alien woman's body trembled under strain far beyond biological limits, her glowing patterns flickering between brilliant white and fading blue. The human tightened his grip slightly, refusing to let her fall forward into the console. The 9th minute ended and the Hunter fleet began full retreat protocols, but too late. The stellar pulse caught the remaining cruisers in a wave of destructive resonance. Engines overloaded, hulls split apart, and the once confident armada dissolved into drifting debris illuminated by the reborn star. The 10th minute began, and the overload reached its peak. She gasped sharply as the final surge tore through her core. The chamber lights exploded outward, and the planetary shields flickered violently. Then silence, complete and absolute. The red star stabilized gradually, its violent flare settling into a steady glow. In orbit, nothing remained of the Hunter fleet but fragments scattered across empty space. The overload sequence ended at the 11th minute, 1 minute short of the required 12, because the enemy was already gone, and inside the shattered chamber the alien woman collapsed forward as the light faded from her skin. The human caught her before she struck the ground, lowering them both to their knees amid broken panels and stunned officials, her breathing shallow, her once radiant patterns now dim and barely visible. The council and military advisors watched in speechless disbelief at the destruction of an enemy they believed invincible. But the human did not look at the drifting debris in orbit. He looked only at her face, waiting for any sign that the queen who had carried the weight of a dying species across the stars had not finally burned out like the suns she had spent her life protecting. For several long seconds after the light faded, no one inside the chamber moved. The only sound was the low hum of damaged systems trying to restart and the distant echo of debris burning in the upper atmosphere. The human remained on his knees, holding her carefully as if she were made of glass instead of star-born strength. Her silver skin had lost its glow. The bright patterns that once pulsed with power now faint and barely visible. And for the first time since he had seen her in Chains Inn, the square, she looked fragile, not weak, but quiet, like a storm that had finally spent itself. The council members slowly approached, their fear gone and replaced with something heavier, realization, because the being they had once called a curse had just saved their entire star system. Above the planet, orbital sensors confirmed what their eyes could already see on the main display. The Hunter fleet was gone, not retreating, not regrouping, destroyed, fragments drifting in silence where certainty once ruled. The red sky outside the chamber windows began to clear gradually, the violent flickers of instability replaced by a steady golden glow as the star stabilized fully under her final act. The human pressed his hand gently against her shoulder and whispered her name, a name she had shared only once in private, a name that carried the history of her people, and for a terrifying moment there was no response. Then faintly, almost too soft to notice, the blue light returned. Beneath her skin, weak but present, her fingers moved slightly against his sleeve, and a quiet breath escaped her lips. Relief moved through the chamber like fresh air after smoke. The council leader exhaled, as if he had been holding that breath since the countdown began. Medical teams rushed forward carefully, but paused when the human raised his hand slightly. Not to refuse help, but to steady the moment. She opened her eyes slowly, no longer blazing with power but clear and aware. "You are still here," she murmured to him, and he allowed himself the smallest smile. "We kept the line," he answered softly. The chamber erupted in a subdued but undeniable emotion. Not celebration, but gratitude mixed with shame, because they understood the full weight of what had nearly happened. They had been minutes away from surrendering her to the very enemy that would have consumed them all. Within hours, the news spread through every level of the city. Citizens who once whispered about curses now stood in open streets staring at the peaceful sky. Children who had thrown stones watched the stars with awe instead of fear, and in the days that followed, the council called for a public assembly in the same square where she had once stood in chains. This time there were no restraints, no guards pointing weapons, only a silent crowd waiting. She stepped forward slowly, still recovering, the human walking beside her not as protector, but as equal. The council leader bowed his head openly before her, an action that shocked many more than the battle had, and spoke words that carried through the entire square. "We were blinded by fear, we judged what we did not understand, and we nearly destroyed ourselves in the process." The alien woman listened without pride or anger, her expression calm, because blame no longer mattered to her, survival did. The leader then knelt fully and offered her the planetary crest, declaring her protector of their world and rightful queen if she chose it. A murmur moved through the crowd, not of doubt but of agreement. Yet she did not reach for the crest immediately. Instead, she looked at the human beside her, remembering how he had knelt first when no one else would stand near her. "I lost my throne with my people," she said gently, "and I do not seek another built on fear." The square fell in a thoughtful silence. Then she continued, "But I will remain here, not as ruler above you, but as guardian among you, because your star is stable now, but others are not, and the hunters were only one shadow in a large universe." Her words carried strength without dominance, and the human stepped forward then, addressing both species gathered in the square. "We fight not because we are the strongest," he said, "but because we refuse to abandon what is right." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. The message had already been written in orbit across shattered enemy ships. Over the following months, cooperation between humans and the alien civilization deepened beyond trade or diplomacy. Research stations were built near the star to monitor instability early. Defense systems were redesigned with flexibility inspired by human tactics. And at the highest cliff overlooking the planet's wide silver ocean, a home was constructed, not a palace, but a place where the alien woman could watch the sunrise of a world she had chosen instead of fled from. Children visited often, no longer afraid of the faint blue glow that sometimes returned. When she walked near the sea, they asked her about stars, and she answered patiently, teaching them that power was not meant for destruction, but for balance. The human remained at her side, not as subject, but as partner, and sometimes when the evening sky turned red again, not with danger, but with beauty, he would look at her and remember the square where everyone called her a curse, and how close the universe had come to losing something extraordinary because fear had spoken louder than truth. The galaxy beyond their system began to hear whispers of what happened there, not a story of conquest or empire, but of a queen without a throne who chose to stand instead of run. and of a human who treated her with dignity when it was easier to walk away. And in quiet transmissions between distant colonies, one final phrase became common when speaking of that system. They once called her a curse. Now they call her queen. Not queen of one world, but of two, because she belonged to her lost civilization and memory, and to this new world and hope. And as the stable stars shone steadily above them, it was clear that the real power that changed everything was never fear, never destruction, but the simple decision to stand beside someone when the entire universe had turned its back.